So we're going to talk about today's MTSS for improving student social, emotional, and behavioral health. And I'm going to talk about data. There's lots of people that are doing different programs and so forth. And while I'm familiar with a lot of them, that's not my forte. But I am interested in how to use data to inform three-tier models, whether it's RTI, MTSS, PBIS, or any of the other ones. How's that? All right, so our agenda. The Star Trek reference will become apparent later on, but anyway, I'm going to tell you McDougal's story. How did I get into this? Why am I doing this? What's my problem? We talk about common behavioral health problems, not for not very long, because you're all psychologists, so I think you covered some of these. I'm going to talk to you about screening and progress monitoring, and especially around MTSS, and how to choose measures, what kind of things to look for, and then what are the core components of MTSS. And I'm going to emphasize the data piece. That's really a presentation today. And then I'm going to run you through some evaluations of MTSS evaluations, so kind of what you can expect and how would you approach evaluating these things. Well, that is working out. All right. So the background, we've known for only about 40 or 50 years that about 20% of children will have some kind of diagnosable mental health difficulty during their school careers. And we know these are predictable, identifiable, preventable, and they dramatically change, alter, and diminish the prognosis of these children if we don't do something about it before these trajectories unfold. So very predictably, a certain percentage of kids will develop externalizing problems, and you can identify these in pre-K or in the local Walmart or wherever you see them, because they're severe tantrums. They're impulsive, they have low frustration tolerance, they're aggressive, defiant, and they're loud, right? Alternatively, internalizing difficulties occur both in childhood and also adolescent onset. And these are less easy to diagnose or to observe because they're internal states like anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and so forth. So we know these occur and they are predictable, and they do significantly, they diminish what our children are able to do. So my story is I've been around a long time, which is good for me and, well, not good for me. I worked in Syracuse City Schools. I started in 1990, and I worked there on and off for 12 years. And I had a background in mental health for 4 years. Before that, I worked in inpatient and outpatient. So I always gravitated towards kids with social, emotional, behavioral difficulties, kids with significant disabilities, and so forth. So working in the urban school district was kind of interesting because it was like working in mental health, only nobody was diagnosed, and we didn't use medication or any of the interventions we use in mental health. The first paper I ever wrote or published was with Kevin Quinn a long time ago, 98. So 2008, that was like 20 some odd years ago. And the paper was about how we really haven't, even though we've known about this for a very long time, we really haven't significantly altered the progress or the widespread, profound difficulties in terms of social emotional functioning. We just didn't in those days address it very well, even though there was researched ways to address that. And so Kevin's quote in here says, so which is it? Are we unable or unwilling to affect substantially the course and prognosis of children identified as having EBD? And he said, it must be one or other of the both, because we just don't do effective things with these kids. We kick them out of school, we exclude them, we suspend them, we put them in alternative programs, we put them in little classrooms, all with all the most behaviorally disordered kids all in the same setting, and none of that works, right? And so I'm hoping that we're approaching a point where we're actually going to come to this with a little more scientifically based procedures. So I'm interested, and I've been waiting for this for a long time. Some things that encourage me are asset and kind of the interest now in children's mental health. Superintendents across the state identified children's mental health as the #1 concern for the last 2 years in the state survey. And in the reopening guidance around the COVIDs for this fall, they talked about MTSS and they talked about counseling plans and also the need to adopt a screening tool to identify students in their areas of need. So my past ramblings around positive psychology goes to school. Are we there yet? And the emphasis of this was really, why are we always disciplining and emphasizing the negative instead of trying to create positive and supportive and nurturing environments for students to develop and teach them to develop coping strategies, to teach them to develop socialization strategies, anger management, whatever it is that that group of students needs. And actually this movement started with Marty Seligman, who was the president of APA one time, which is very ironic if you follow Marty Seligman, because he's the guy that started with the learned helplessness concept, where he's shocking dogs in little cages and realizing if you shocked them enough, even if you opened a door to let them get off the shock pad, they still wouldn't do it. They had learned helplessness. All of a sudden he was the positive psychology guy. So I thought that was kind of neat. Also, I wrote papers about, infusing research-based practices into the schools to try and alter the course of behavioral disorders as they unfold. And of course I did this, and you can read publications and all that, but it really hasn't kind of got absorbed in terms of how we typically deal with kids in schools. And so on and on and on and on, gap in research and so forth. So my key idea is, so I was one of the team members with Ed Irwin and Jim Wright, who developed the SBIT model, school-based intervention team in Syracuse, which was a pre-referral intervention model trying to implement interventions prior to just putting kids or referring kids for special ed. After having done that and validating that that really worked, I was totally ready to give it up because RTI was coming out now. And instead of just referring one kid, I could screen a whole classroom, a whole grade level, a whole school, and identify quickly kids with literacy concerns especially, and provide them early targeted services so that they didn't become a special ed referral in the future. And at that time, which was, I don't know, the 90s some point, I couldn't believe that we didn't do the same thing for behavior, given that about 20% of our kids had significant literacy problems that were going to infect the rest of their life, where at least 20% of our kids also had glaring social, emotional, behavioral deficits and difficulties, which were also going to significantly affect their life. So I saw the need to do a CBM for behavior. And I went to my first NASP in 98 and went to every booth there, the vendors, and asked them, what do you have for behavioral health screening or mental health screening? And they didn't have anything. So we've come a long ways, but we haven't come a long ways. We've come a long ways in terms of thinking about it, but what we lack's a little finishing up. So hopefully we'll get there at some point today. So think about what we commonly do that's effective. Problematic territories we've settled with prevention. Visual impairment, hearing loss, and speech. Speech and language services are hands down the most effective special ed service there are. They declass more students than all the other services combined. And that's because as soon as you get to school, the first thing you do is you get screened for speech and language. And if you have a difficulty, they target it right there and they treat it very intensely and very early, and it works. And that's the model that the other kinds of difficulties children encounter that are preventable. That's the model for doing good work. So think every kid gets a vision screen, every kid gets a hearing screen, every kid gets a speech and language screen. Only 6% of kids have visual impairment, 1% significant hearing loss, and speech and language about 8 to 9%. And then consider there's 20% or more in some urban districts, with socioeconomic levels that are below poverty in many cases. So anyway, we're effective with this. Territories we're exploring. I think RTI has shown us how to do good work around literacy and reading and preventing reading difficulties. We lack a little bit in terms of implementing that and doing it well. But at least we know what we're doing, and some districts are doing a really nice job, and in other places I don't see much work. And then the final frontier really is getting serious about children's mental health. And whether you call it mental health or social emotional learning or social emotional development or behavioral health, I don't really care. The emphasis here is on vision deficits significantly impact students' performance in the future. So does hearing, so does speech, so does literacy, well, so does mental health. And these things are identifiable early on, and we can, if we catch them early enough, and if we intervene in the right way, we can actually change the trajectory of these kids that are going to have significant difficulties later on. All right, well, kids have been telling us for decades. So most of you are aware that the CDC, supposedly every 2 years, but now it's been a little behind, does a youth risk survey via the risk surveillance system or a behavioral risk surveillance system. And they survey high school students from across the country, thousands of them, and have been doing so since 1991. So they have literally millions of survey responses across decades. So I was interested in terms of, kind of the patterns of behavioral health challenges and so forth. So the last survey was done in 2017, and externalizing related issues or outcomes, you can see over here, significant numbers of students carried a weapon in school, carried a gun to school, were threatened or injured, bullied, and, didn't go to school because they felt unsafe. I don't think that surprises anybody. We're working on this, and of course, there's more work to do. One of the most surprising things to me was around internalizing issues, especially the fact that 31% of kids reported that they felt persistent feelings of hopelessness. Persistent meaning that they felt hopeless every day consecutively for 2 or more weeks within the last 12 months. 17% considered suicide within the last 12 months. 14% developed a plan, 7% attempted, and over 3% had an injury that was significant enough to send them to the ER, which doesn't sound like a hugely high rate. But if you consider the average high school of 1,000 students, 170 students are considering suicide. 140 of them developed a plan, right? 70 of them attempted. That's crazy. And so it was hard for me to really kind of grasp that. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing, though, is this isn't a new problem. We're kind of getting a new perspective on it. But if you look across time from 91 to 2017, the rates of kids who attempted suicide is fairly stable. We just, in the old days, really didn't look at it too hard. We had crisis teams for when kids attempted or completed, and we had hotlines for when they were so bad off, they're about on the edge of doing it, they have one last person to call, instead of really significantly putting emphasis on preventing this stuff. Suicide is one of the most common causes of death for our youth, and this is nothing new or no surprise. And negative affect, anxiety, depression, negative thoughts is a significant contributor to this. So what really helped ground these numbers in reality for me was a woman I work with in Colorado, and I don't know, I was going to name the district, but I don't think I will. We had an item 24 debacle, we call that. So in the BIMAS system, item 24 assesses thoughts of self-harm. And this must be the first site that actually had students participate in the universal screening. So they had teachers do the screening, and they also had students do it. And they went from identifying around 20 kids with thoughts of self-harm via the teacher rating to around 200 when they did the student rating. And a piece of the BIMAS is if that item is endorsed at a level higher than 0, meaning they have any kind of frequency of thoughts of self-harm, it automatically emails the case manager and the principal so that somebody can follow up. Well, they had 200 of them, and unfortunately, they did the screening on a Friday. So we had a very long weekend in trying to help them plan for their response. But when we did the numbers, 200 kids was about 17% of that school. So It's actual reality. I mean, those student responses are accurate, I believe. And so these are the things we're trying to prevent: externalizing difficulties, internalizing problems, or lessen the effect of internalizing difficulties, and also cognitive and attention problems, which we really haven't talked about because it's not folks, committing suicide or going to jail, but it is a significant difficulty in terms of keeping up with the Common Core, especially. Right? So I think it's time for a change. All the stuff we do around kids' social, emotional, and behavioral health is backwards. We provide a whole bunch of energy at the end of the line when it's too late to really help them, and the interventions we use typically aren't all that effective. And so I'm really impressed with the work that a lot of districts have done recently in terms of prevention and social emotional learning and infusing that curriculum into the classroom. From my mind, we need to abandon our old practices, which I call RTC, responding to crisis, and start spending our time, responding to intervention. So even though we know 20% of kids, and in Syracuse it was much higher than that, are going to develop a diagnosable mental health difficulty, behavioral health screenings occur in less than 5% of districts across the country. And for the life of me, I can't understand why. On the one hand, the scientist part of me says, I can't believe we're not doing this. On the other hand, the person working in the schools forever is saying, I know why, right? The first time I brought this up to my special ed director in the 90s, who was a great guy, I valued him. He was a very politically savvy special ed director. He's a very charged environment. He'd been there a long time. He's very smart. And we were doing great things in the area of literacy and interventions with kids. I said, we really need to do the same thing around students in their emotional and behavioral development. I'd like to screen kids for that and try and intervene earlier than we usually do. And he goes, oh crap, Jim. He goes, if we screened all the kids in the building and found all these behavioral health concerns or mental health concerns, we'd have to do something about it. And I said, Ed, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard you say, which he didn't like very much. But I was like, we already do something about it. We kick them out of school. We suspend them. We have the state, rip us a new one because we got suspensions that are so high. I got a scrapbook full of kids that I consulted on in alternative settings that eventually went to jail, that were involved in shootings and robberies and all this other stuff. But we weren't brave enough, to be honest with you, to identify them early so we could do something about it. So we just sat back and waited until the inevitable unfold. So
Dr. McDougal, sorry. I do have 2 questions.
Yes.
At what age group would you recommend using behavioral health screenings? Does that change for a self-report style of screening?
So there's 2 questions there. What age would I recommend we begin? Why not begin just like the speech and language folks right in kindergarten? I can sit in a pre-K classroom for an hour and identify kids that are going to have significant behavioral difficulties in the future, right? And so can you, and so can any other school psychologist. Why not identify them early and figure out what we can do about it? Around the self-report, I know there's earlier self-report versions than age 12, which is where we started ours. I have not seen one, the reliability is all that great. So I think self-report's important from about 11 or 12 years old on. So when the earlier screenings are probably more likely to catch externalizing difficulties, cognitive attention difficulties, social skill difficulties, academic functioning difficulties, and less likely to catch internalizing problems, which isn't great, but it's okay because a lot of significant internalizing problems occur in early adolescence. So I think teacher ratings are really great for elementary and even maybe intermediate grades. And I also think if you want to do this work really well, that you'd include self-version somewhere around 12 years old. Because you can see how that increases the number of students that are identified, but it's a lot of work. I mean, but alternatively, instead of doing crisis response teams responding to suicide, you're doing teams where you're responding to kids in a preventative way. So hopefully it's more rewarding work. Any other questions, Colleen?
Back to that 24-item survey that you were discussing, what assessment was that?
It's not 24 item survey, it's item 24.
Item
There's,
24.
so it's the BIMAS, the Behavior Intervention Monitoring Assessment System. And, you know, and towards full disclosure and all, I am the senior author of that. And I do make a limited amount of royalties on that. I think at this point I made about a nickel an hour for the work I put in the last 20 years. And I'll show you that assessment.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. All right. Increasingly, my thinking in working with schools, and now I found research that validates my thinking, which is always nice, is that I think teachers are about the best method of improving general mental health of students, right? This survey, it was a meta-analysis, evaluated a bunch of studies, about 50,000 students, and found that mental health interventions or social-emotional interventions integrated in the classroom were the most effective and had effect sizes oftentimes larger than individual counseling. I don't know, I must have been a pretty poor counselor when I worked in the schools because I did hundreds of hours of individual face-to-face counseling where I pulled kids out of a classroom in either group or one-on-one format and counseled them with my wisdom, right? Anger management, control, zones of regular, you know, whatever I did. And then I put them back in the classroom and 2 days later, they'd be blowing up doing the same thing they did before talking to me. And so I dramatically limited the amount of individual counseling I did in the schools. And if it was requested, I would actually go into the classroom and do it for the whole class. And so this is a natural extension of this. And the evaluations I do of schools, curriculum infused in or instruction infused in the curriculum that's done by a teacher every day is hands down the most effective, I think, in terms of altering the course of students' significant difficulties, lowers their concerns. So the barriers to doing this work are always three things in any school: time, money, and staff. We don't have time, we don't have the money, we don't have staff. And I have heard that for so many decades, I'm fed up. I don't even listen to it anymore. I go, you got more time, more money, more staff than any other organization around here that works with kids. They're with you more than they are sometimes with their parents at home, right? We have time, we have money, and we have staff. We use our time, we use our money, we use our staff doing things oftentimes that don't improve children's outcomes. We're locked into all this regulatory stuff. Annual review is a perfect example, right, of a waste of hours and hours and days of our lives, right? We should do annual reviews 10 at a time unless somebody has an issue. Maybe that's not a good idea, but maybe reduce the number of things we do that don't have an effect and spend our time, our money, and our staff on things that do. And don't get me wrong, I'm a huge proponent of schools. I think schools are, you know, they have the most compassionate, most educated, most hardworking folks that surround children. And they often get hamstringed by these things that reduce their effectiveness. So I think we just need to change how we perceive the barriers and work through them. The other thing is in education, we're the only place we buy new houses without selling the old one, right? And so we need to give up less effective practices and embrace ones that are more effective. And the way to do that really is with data. If you don't have data that indicates what you're doing is effective, that program will die. And if you do have data that indicates you're effective and you're politically savvy, that's a program sustains over time. All right, so evolution of three tiered models: MTSS, RTI, ISF, PBIS. And this is all good stuff. The public health model, right? George Elby. The foundation for it all is data, right? And so what helped RTI evolve is CBM came out as a way to quickly screen kids, to find out kids that were having literacy deficits before they were disorders. And it also allowed practitioners to monitor their progress over time. And by progress, I don't mean like the Y at beginning of the year and end of the year. I mean, every week, so we could alter instruction throughout the year. Because prior to that, we would lose a whole year of instruction before we ever found out the kid maybe wasn't progressing like we'd like. And that's if they used an assessment that was reliable and valid enough to capture that, right? So universal screening, as I indicated, occurs in other areas, and it really should occur in the behavioral domain as well. And we all know that the components of a screening and progress monitoring measure, the brief, time-sensitive, or sensitive to change over time and empirically based. So I see all these folks creating their own screening measures or their surveys, or they adopt the survey with there's no indication of any kind of psychometrics. And I think, it's better than doing nothing. But in my mind, why not if you're going to do it, let's do it right. Because I don't want to miss kids that have problems, and I also don't want to identify kids with problems that don't have them, right? All right. And so I'll talk a little bit about what I would look for. And this is really brief. There's a lot more you could do, but cursory kind of, if we're going to adopt a screening and progress monitoring measure, what would we look for, right? I actually did this with superintendents, and I moved really fast. It went better than I thought, because I never thought they'd sit through reliability and validity. But I think they got some of that. So anyway, consider as a background that lots of these scales are coming from traditional diagnostic scales, right? The BASC and the Achenbach and so forth. So as a backdrop, behavior rating scales for diagnostic purposes are made with traditional test construction models. And what they try and do is identify items that most reliably identify or differentiate children in different categories, different diagnostic or non-diagnostic categories, right? And so what they're tapping, what these items wind up being, is often trait related, because this kid's more like ADHD. This kid's, got more like conduct problems and whatever. They're all often long scales, and they're time consuming because they want a high degree of accuracy. They don't want to call a kid conduct disorder. In fact, they're not. So in terms of how they're made, diagnostic scales are going to be made differently than screening and progress monitoring scales. Right? And it was the same kind of thing that happened when CBM was being developed. So around a universal screening measure, they should be normed. We should know how they work with certain populations, especially if you're in a diverse setting. I don't want to adopt a screening measure that's going to, identify all my culturally diverse kids as having some kind of difficulty or disorder. I'm going to have a political nightmare. And it's also, that's a poor use of your time. And so it should be normed on different groups of kids. It should also be normed on both a clinical and typical sample, so I know to what extent that's going to identify kids with problems when they have problems, identify kids as being fine when they're fine, okay? It should be reliable. It means it's accurate and consistent, because as we all know, the more error you add to a measure, the less useful it is. And so we want to look at internal consistency, test-retest, center score, and whatever. In terms of validity, for the screening purpose, it should be able to identify kids with problems when they have those, and identify kids as being fine when they're in fact fine. A good example is the first round of COVID tests that was adopted in the United States had a sensitivity of about 40%, meaning if you took that test and you were identified as being fine, there's a 40% likelihood you were, right? So that's not accurate enough, I guess what I'm saying, but we didn't have anything else. And I'll talk more about sensitivity and specificity and all that good stuff. If you're looking at a measure and you want to know, so what kind of coefficients would I look for? These would be the reliability coefficients, the validity coefficients, and then the classification stats. So some common screeners. The BEST is a great screener. It's a derivative of the BAS. Cecil Reynolds is a very smart guy, right? And so the sensitivity, meaning the ability to identify kids with problems when in fact they have problems, ranges by rater and age group and so forth, from about 0.5 to about 0.8. Specificity is the ability to identify kids that are fine when in fact they're fine. And that's much higher, but of course more kids are fine. So, it's a slower pitched ball, if you will. And you can see that the BEST has a much younger threshold for the self version. The BEST is also created from a diagnostic scale using a factor loading procedure where they identify the items that load best on that scale. In my mind, it's a very fine screener, but I don't believe it wasn't made to be used for progress monitoring. And so folks that, do that repeatedly over time to evaluate their programs, I don't know what kind of numbers you're going to get. The BIMAS, which is the Behavior Intervention Monitoring Assessment System, It was created first using a model for identifying change-sensitive items. And secondly, of those items, we selected those that did the best job in screening. And so the sensitivity of scales from the parent to the teacher to the self range from midpoint 7, to 8, with the teacher being the highest, around 85%. Specificity, same kind of thing. And so other procedures or scales, the SSIS and the SSBD, don't have classification stats, so we don't know how they work. The SSBD is a multiple gating procedure that was developed by Hill Walker, and that was the first screening procedure I was aware of when I was working in the schools, and I was blown away that somebody actually developed it and validated it. At this point, I think there's better methods and ones that are more researched. Anyway, there's all kinds of resources for selecting screeners. There's the one that's referenced here from the Project Aware in Ohio. The folks from Florida, Nate Van Epps and a group down there just released a new guidebook to universal screeners. And if you look on the internet, you'll find them. Right. So the other piece of the equation, though, is not only that it screens kids and identifies kids with concerns, but also that it's able to progress monitor. Do these ratings change in response to an intervention? And also, do they remain constant if no intervention is present? Because we don't want a measure that's just tapping in the developmental effects. We want one that actually assesses therapeutic change, right? So for progress monitoring, and this is really the tough part and what folks are researching right now, is it sensitive to change? Will it reflect students' progress or response to an intervention? And can I use it across different student groups, different programs, different treatments, and different tier levels? So I don't want to do a different intervention for tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3, or for kids in this age group versus this age group, or for kids getting CBT versus DBT. I want a general measure that I can use across programs and groups and tiers. Okay. And this isn't as easy as it sounds. So our guru for this, Scott Meyer, has studied change sensitivity since the 80s. And I learned a lot from working with Scott over the last few decades, and read some of his stuff. And what he was reporting on in the 80s was that oftentimes the effect size of a treatment or a therapy for children, the effect size based on the measure they used, was oftentimes bigger than the effect of the treatment, if that makes sense. So if you use one measure, you get a much bigger response than if you used another measure. And he started teaching me about why that might be so. So there's Scott, and I call him the Edison of change sensitivity, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But he developed in the 90s, the late 90s, a model for identifying items that were sensitive to change. He called it the Intervention Item Selection Rules, IIRS. And what he did is he worked in a large children's mental health with a facility, and he created scales based on different items, and he gave them to clinicians to rate the students they were seeing. And he looked at the responses across time of kids that were getting treatment versus those that weren't. And he kept items that changed in an expected direction when the student was getting an intervention. And he threw out items that didn't. And he also threw out items that changed in response to no intervention, just changed over time. There's some other steps to that model, but essentially that's what he's doing. And so I'll let him explain it best. All right, so that's a simple view, I guess. Scott also did some interesting work and published a book recently looking at outcomes and effectiveness of treatment when clinicians use progress monitoring and outcome assessments versus when they don't. And in my mind, it really paralleled some of the research we saw developed related to CBM, where students that are monitored CBM have a much bigger response to teaching to instruction than students that aren't. So what he found was that when we did these brief scales and clinicians were providing information about their clients weekly, that they could alter their treatment and make it more effective and reduce what Scott calls treatment failure, which makes total sense. And so wondering why I didn't ever think of that. So anyway, in terms of adopting an MTSS measure, does it measure both strengths and risks? Some MTSS and some SEL folks are advising us to use only strength-based assessments. And I really think that's a mistake, because just because a student develops self-awareness and grit doesn't mean they're not going to go be an excellent bank robber, and you get the idea. It doesn't mean that we're preventing these behavioral health concerns that we know the research has told us for 40 years are significant in terms of their later development. So if I'm going to do this work, I want to make sure that they're developing strengths, but also that we're lowering their concern levels in terms of behavioral health problems. Can it inform intervention design? Does it tap the kinds of things that can be used by an intervention team or a data team to inform an intervention, select an intervention, and strengthen intervention? Can it be used for both screening and progress monitoring? Because I don't want to screen kids with one technique and progress monitor with another and hope they relate to each other. I want to use the same thing. How useful is it for evaluation across interventions, across ages, settings, raters? We really didn't have many people using the self and parent versions of the BIMAS until last March, when all of a sudden we're remote. And really, especially this year too, kids that are remote, districts are adopting different kinds of assessment procedures, where oftentimes a kid that isn't in school, they'll have the parent fill out a rating in addition to the teacher for the younger kids, and have the self or the student do a self, just to make sure that they have a correct perspective on the kid. And most importantly, is the scale or technique technically adequate? Is it reliable? Is it valid? And if it isn't, I don't think we should use it, or I don't think we should rely on it for decision making. I'm going to talk to you about the BIMAS because it's the only scale I ever developed. So it's the only one I'm really familiar with. These same kind of uses and procedures and so forth should be available in whatever behavioral skill. Three Musketeers of the BIMAS. It's me. Achilles Bardos is a test developer. He's a Jack Neglieri protege. He is the current publisher, because our publisher did not do a very good job of the programming, and long story short, in a decade, big long divorce, Achilles took it over and got it reprogrammed. He's our publisher. Scott Myers, brains behind the operation. He's our Edison, and he taught us how to kind of construct this scales. So what I always wanted is a way to screen kids quickly, reliably, for different tiers of intervention, and to identify areas of concern for a tier 1 intervention. Progress monitoring folks, decide whether or not they're getting better. Program evaluation, I want to demonstrate whatever I'm doing works, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to change it so it does work. And so that's kind of what we developed the scale for. We also thought that we should have multiple informants available, parents, teachers, self. There's a clinician form as well, which is really close to the teacher form. So we can get information from different sources about how the kid's doing. So the BIMAS looks at conduct, negative affect, and cognitive attention, which are, externalizing, internalizing, and attention problems. The three biggest concern areas that develop in school-age kids. We also look at social functioning and academic functioning, because these strengths should, if we increase these strengths, they should decrease the concerns that we have with kids. But I don't trust just increasing strengths and hoping that it decreases concerns. I want to measure them both directly. So the BIMAS uses T-scales or T-scores, which most folks are fairly familiar with, right? Every 10 is a new risk level. And we've got the color coding with green, yellow, and red. I think scales that are doing this work should have some kind of normative sample. So we use about, just under 4,000 or 5,000 kids, about 2,000 for parent teacher, and self-report somewhat less. We also have a significant clinical sample. And that's really important, because I want to study and validate that this measure for screening identifies kids with problems when they have them, and also identifies kids as being fine when they're fine. And so these are different clinical groups that we use for each of the rating forms. I also think it should be studied with different races and ethnicities, because I worked in a diverse setting. The last thing I wanted to do was to implement an assessment that was biased in terms of race, culture, and so forth. In terms of, I read a lot of reports on different screenings or different assessments, and they often highlight the reliability, how reliable their scale is. And you got these alphas and all this, and reliability is like step one. So like, I like to shoot long range, so this my stats buddy does too. So he put this PowerPoint together, and he said reliable but not valid, which would be the top left, means they're consistent, you're accurate, but your scope's off, you're shooting way low, right? And so not reliable and valid means now I'm shooting consistently and I'm accurate and I'm hitting the bullseye. That's what I want, right? But you can also be neither reliable or valid, and that means you're just shooting all over the place, right? And so I don't want to have an assessment that's not reliable or valid. I don't want one that's reliable but not valid. And so we need to look at both of those, I guess. So Cronbach's alpha is an internal consistency measure. It's how reliable is the scale. And so I think this should be available for any scale to look at. So these are the ones we got in the BIMAS, and they're all 0.8, 0.9, and high 0.7s, which is acceptable for a screener. In terms of validity, I think the most important stat in validity is classification stats. And I almost see where test developers now, the newer ones, are not publishing these stats. And I don't know why. They're doing item response theory and all these other fancy stats, but they're not telling you whether the screener actually identifies correctly kids with problems and kids with not problems. And if I was going to choose it and pay money for it, I'd want that statistic. The other thing we did in terms of standardization, we used a Cone-D, which is an effect size, and we looked at the difference in scores between kids with known problems and those without problems. And obviously there should be a significant score difference, right? So in terms of the effect sizes, we looked at each of the different raters. So this is the teacher scores for clinical sample, and you can see that the kids that had clinical problems in terms of conduct, negative affect, and so forth, had Cone-Ds all over 1 point something, which means they had a standard deviation higher score than kids without problems. And that's exactly what you're looking for. The other stat, as I said, that's most important to me is how well does it classify kids? So the teacher scale or the teacher rating on BIMAS identifies correctly 85% of kids. So sensitivity and specificity being the two pieces of that. So sensitivity is 83% sensitive to kids with problems, specificity 85%. The reason that's important is because you can increase sensitivity, but it's going to decrease specificity, if that makes any sense. So if I increase my score to capture more kids with problems, I could get that up to 95%. But I'm also going to identify a bunch of kids that don't have problems that I'm going to waste my time and resources on when I never had to. So the same kind of thing for parents. You can see the parents, the Cone-Ds are all over standard deviations, which is what you want. And accuracy rates, 78%, that's pretty good for parent rating. Sensitivity and specificity around 80. And then kids self, the Cone-Ds are all approximating standard deviation, which is fine. And these classification stats are not as accurate as the parent and the teacher, but any of you that have adolescents and you ask them at the end of the day when they get home, how was your day in school, or how are you doing in school, or how's your grades, you'll know that their reliability may not be all that you desired. So in addition to standard scale for screening, we were honored when the BESS adopted flex assessments, because we had those 10 years prior. So we put flex assessments in the BIMAS system, and those are 1 to 3 item scales, would be equivalent to like a daily behavior report card or a direct behavior rating or IEP goal or a treatment goal. And these are informal scales that folks can build and put in the system so it's graphed over time. And that's kind of like, you get a trend line and a little graph. And the idea here was that we could do treatment with a kid and do a flex assessment every week. And then at the end of 10 weeks or 20 weeks, or when you thought there was an effect, you could give a standardized scale, which is more lengthy, 34 items, to look at with a reliable and valid measure to what extent. Across the 3 tiers, this is what we use to look at tier 1 for universal screening given in the fall. And so with the triangles there would allow us to identify areas for intervention. So with this kind of data, I would probably target something around social and or academic functioning as a target of my tier 1 instruction. And so we would implement SEL instruction to target the social skills of students in this subgroup, and also teach them planning, things that would improve their academic functioning. So paying attention, concentrating, planning, doing your homework, assignment completion, whatever. And we could also set goals around this. And we want to reduce the kids in the red level for social functioning from 36% down to, 20% by Christmas. Same thing in academics. And then we could do another screening, another winter screening to see the extent to which those levels actually decreased. So one use of tier 1 data is to inform your programming. Another use of tier 1 data is to identify kids in need of extra support. So this would be how, at least in the BIMAS system, we do that. We look at each of these areas, and if I click on them, it'll rank kids from highest to lowest in terms of their ratings for conduct problems, negative affect problems. Most times when we do this kind of data analysis with teams, the kids with conduct problems are all well known, and many of them in the red level are in special education or, receiving some kind of intervention. However, negative affect, not so much. These kids are often have great attendance. Their grades may be very high, and yet they're suffering inside. And so tier 2 groups can be arranged by looking at students' level of concern. And then if we want to look at individual students, we can actually drill down to the individual level and look at which items on here most identify the kid as having a concern. Okay. The other thing we wanted to do is look at, in a standardized way, to what extent did this kid change over time? So is our programming effective? And so we built in an RCI meter in here, relative change index. It'll tell you over the course of universal assessments over time whether or not students are getting better, which hadn't been done in the past. If there's any questions about that, I'd be more than happy to field them. And if not, I'm just going to show you a couple examples of evaluations that have been done using the BIMAS to illustrate outcomes associated with MTSS work. I think probably nationally one of the best school-based, school-driven, school-owned MTSS models that's been around longest is the comprehensive behavioral health model from Boston Public Schools. Boston's been doing this well over 10 years. They have a very smart director, Andrea Amador, who is very savvy. She's very intelligent. She's very active in NASP. She's a former school psychologist. She supports very heavily what school psychologists could be doing if they weren't doing WISCs and WIATs. And the outcomes that we've seen her generate are awesome. Annual report from 2018 and 19, Boston Public Schools is doing this model in 71 schools, serving over 31,000 kids. And these schools aren't like, suburban schools. They're 74% high needs kids, 55%, low SES, and so forth. 45% first language other than English. They do a multi-tier model, and it's very, very similar to a lot of MTSS. So what they emphasize is instruction, assessment, and database decision making. They use PBIS as a tier 1 foundation, and then they implement SEL instruction on top of that. And they've used the BIMAS for around 10 years to evaluate their work, to improve their work. They're also pretty savvy about implementation. So they take cohorts of schools every 2 years, and they really emphasize and train them on tier 1 for 2 years before they even get into tier 2, which I think is is a smart decision if you have limited resources, because that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. So instead of a triangle, of course, they got to have a lighthouse because they're from Boston. And they have different programs, obviously, at different tiers. The other things they've adopted is second step curriculum, DBT, James Mazza's stuff, and so forth. They also work closely with Children's Hospital and a number of other organizations that they infuse to help them with their work. And we've been working with them for a long time, and we present with them a lot. And I'm really impressed with it every time that I work with them, the outcomes that they have in an urban, diverse setting. So they use effect sizes to evaluate their outcomes. They're influenced by the work of John Hattie. He says about 0.4 is an effect size is typically about 1 year growth. And so they looked at the literature and said group counseling averages about 0.58, individual counseling about 0.85. And that would be the percentage of a standard deviation of change that's associated with these interventions. So Boston's model, you look at by area or by composite or by concern area. And from the fall to the spring, Boston saw on average overall effect size of 0.8 in terms of students' cognitive attention. 1.0, a whole standard deviation in terms of improving kids' conduct. And negative affect of 1.2, which over the last 10 years or so, I've been impressed that most MTSS models have the highest effect sizes or highest progress in negative affect, which is interesting because those are the kids that typically we don't serve. Academic functioning about 0.9 and social functioning about 0.9. So those are very high effect sizes, higher than individual therapies that we often do. And so these folks, they've got all kinds of awards and accomplishments, and they've been in Time Magazine and Phi Data Capital and all that stuff. They're also very approachable. So if you have questions, or I brought them out here to Syracuse to train local school districts on how to do this work. Brought them out here a couple times, and it's a very proficient, productive, and intelligent group of folks. I've also done these same kind of evaluations with other districts right around me that aren't Boston. And so one suburban district we worked with for a couple of years, I did their evaluation for administrative council. And what we do is we look at the mean for an entire school or district, the mean at the fall and the mean in the spring. And we look at the change and we compute that in effect size. So as you can see, this year, this district only had effect sizes of 0.1, 0.1, 0.03. It's not all that impressive, right? But what Boston taught me is that these are clouded by typical kids, because 80% of your kids are typical, they're not going to change much. So if you really want to see the effect sizes, you look at kids in the yellow and red level. And so when I looked at kids who were assessed at some risk, so T-scores of 60 to 70 or 69, you see the effect sizes start 0.45, 0.92, and so forth. And this is only tier 1 programming. This is SEL on top of PBIS that this district implemented. So these are just a little, yeah. Now, if you look at the kids that were assessed in the red level, so T-scores of 70 or higher, these would be considered clinical range kids. They made the largest amount of progress in response to a tier 1 intervention. Effect sizes approaching or over 1.0. Other than cognitive attention, we didn't make them pay attention any better, but we made them more social, more academic, better conduct, and so forth. So if we can look at evaluation like this, plus an evaluation of their literacy progress over time, that's a good foundation for supporting kids to overcome developmental hurdles they might not otherwise overcome. Questions, Colleen?
Yes, I do have a number of questions. How long does it take for the teacher to complete the BIMAS?
2 minutes.
All right.
34 items. You want to see them? Actually, if folks want a tour, I don't know if I want to do that in NIAS's dime. Once you have them, if they email me, right there, McDougal@oswego.edu, I'll set up a Zoom conference with them and take them through this.
Okay.
there's 30
I'm sorry. Can you discuss the ages for the BIMAS? Is it just for
K-12.
older kids? Okay.
K-12.
Actually,
pre-K-12. We got a pre-K thing we put in there a couple years ago.
And is parental consent needed for the BIMAS or any other universal screener?
Oh, don't get me started. Don't get me started. You did it. You did it. I can click out to another PowerPoint. So, parental consent is not legally required. Parental assent is. And this because you're just like you don't get parental consent to do the STAR assessment or Ames Web or any academic screener. You shouldn't need it in this domain either. However, state ed might not interpret it that way. And why that is, I don't know. Because the consent issue is related to PPRA, the People Protection Rights Amendment. And it clearly states that is only for money that has been used from the federal Department of Education. And it's only for assessments that are mental health assessments given to individual kids. Perry Zirkle, I actually asked this question in the communique in October of 2018, and Perry Zirkle responded to it. If you go through the archives of the communique, you can find it, or you can email me and I'll send it to you. And Perry says you don't need consent. Like you don't need a signed consent from every kid's parent in the school. You need to offer them, give them a letter, inform them about the MTSS project that you're doing, how you're supporting students' social emotional learning, and as a part of that, you're going to administer a screener. You should identify it by name, and you should allow parents to opt out if they wish to do so. Now, if you identify a student with a concern and you want to do a tier 2 intervention that's therapeutic in nature, and you're going to provide assessments as a piece of that, then I would get parental consent.
Thank you. And do any of these districts you were mentioning use the BIMAS to monitor still?
Monitor what?
Do they still use the BIMAS to monitor?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's dead. That's what I'm talking about. No, actually, I had totally assumed that this year with the pandemic that most folks would take a year off, give it up, not go forward with plans they had. And I am pleasantly surprised that I've never been so busy in my life. That as part of the reopening plan, a lot of districts submitted to the state. They included this as their universal screener, and that superintendents and school boards are following through on their commitment to support students' mental health, especially during this pandemic when kids are home and they're losing the social support they have in schools.
And you mentioned before social emotional curriculum. You mentioned DBT and Second Step. Is there any other that you would like to talk about? And is this K through 12?
So my interest is K through 12. Somebody's asking me for programs I would recommend, or
some aspects. Can you talk about some aspects that they have used? That's what they're asking.
Yeah, so if you go to the What Works Clearinghouse, there's a number of programs there. We also have on the BIMAS system, we have external resources, and we put together an intervention guide. And so these intervention guides, so people ask us, do you have interventions in your program? No, we don't, because we're not an intervention program. We're an assessment that you can use for any program you adopt. Can I point you in the right direction? Probably. But I every time I recommend something to somebody, they'll find something else because that's what's acceptable to their staff or for whatever reason. We do have spreadsheets like this where periodically we go through the, what works clearinghouse or different sources, and we put them together by tier 1, 2, 3, 4, by area of concern. This is conduct. These would be the websites that relate to those programs. Since I teach in a college, I have a great resource called My Students. So I give them an assignment where I ask them to, with a template, identify programs that schools could use in different tiers for improving student social emotional health. So CASTLE's a good resource. What We're Clearinghouse, Intervention Central's been around a long time. The PBIS website is good. There's a website, the Washington State Superintendents of Washington State has a website with all kinds of MTSS resources on it. If somebody needs, I don't know, advice or some kind of, if you don't want me to point them towards some kind of resources for programs, just email me or call me. That's my cell phone. And I take calls all the time from people that are interested in this work. I can also, what I try and do is not give my advice, but hook you up with somebody that's doing similar work that I think is doing a good job and that has done it longer, so that you can talk to them, somebody in the schools. Next.
Can you talk a little bit more about success with the Boston Public Schools?
Anything specifically?
In regarding to using the BIMAS.
So I'm not exactly sure what their interest is, but so Boston's been our longest collaborator, our largest collaborator, and we've learned as much from them as they ever would from us. As they've implemented this and kind of what I think led the country really in doing this work, at least in terms of a public school doing this work. I'm not talking about researchers, in university settings that are going down to infuse what they think they should do in a school setting. I'm talking about a school. They've used this work to support their project because they evaluate it and they identify, and they've made it successful. And so now they can get external support. They've lasted through at least 4 superintendents, which is very rare for an initiative like this. And they've done it because their director's a very intelligent, savvy person, and she has data that she's shown to the mayor and the commission, the school board. And so she gets folks to support her work through the use of data and illustrating it. So I don't know if that answered the question. If there's a follow-up, I'd be happy to take it because I think a little more specifics would be helpful. But I did the same kind of evaluation for a local district here, suburban district here. I've done several times. And just report their data back to the superintendent and the school board, superintendent and administrative council, special ed directors meetings, whatever. Right now we worked with the state of Hawaii for years. They've adopted it to progress monitor their special ed students, which is interesting because we did this as a preventative kind of assessment, but they use it to progress monitor the kids in the IEP with the behavioral management concern. And so we evaluate the services of different districts around that area.
Do you have a resource that would explain the effectiveness of the BIMAS so administration would be willing to adopt its use?
Do I have a resource what?
That would explain the effectiveness of the BIMAS so administration would be willing to adopt its use.
Well, so I don't know that the BIMAS has an effectiveness. It just does screening and progress monitoring well. And it's up to you all to be effective, right? I do have some documents and I do have some PowerPoints. Actually, if I can close out of this, do you have, Colleen, do you have a server that you can use to disseminate information or?
We can link on the attendee dashboard.
All right, because this is a Google Drive I put together a while ago, and I'd be happy to share the link with you. And it's just a collection of things, McDougal things. But there's the CDC risk survey. There's flyers and fact sheets. We did a little MTSS fact sheets and SEL fact sheets and so forth. There's all of our conference PowerPoints, the technical manuals and peer-reviewed articles. For the Boston folks, they've got a number of things, their annual reports and their publications. And so I would be happy to give you this. There's the 1.5 day training that we did in Syracuse and the handouts associated with that. And so I'd be happy to make this available to folks if they're interested in that. And then, if they have questions, they can email me.
Okay, great. I can reach out to you after the conference.
You're breaking up now.
Sorry. No, I can reach out to you after the conference and we can put that on the desk.
Yeah, cool. Yep.
What is the cost of the screener? Is there a group rate?
So the cost of the screener is $4 a kid. And that's largely because of the programming costs and running a secure server, especially in today's landscape. The group rate is in New York State. I've been able to work with BOCES and the associated RICs and establish coasters with them. So we have the coaster language already developed. And so districts would be reimbursable, somewhere around 75 to 80%. So that's the cost and that's the group rate. I think that would be the best way to go, probably. Do
districts typically buy the group rate? Or
What's
is
that?
Is there a district rate?
Yeah, I mean, it's $4 a student, and there is a group rate for over so many kids, over 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. I mean, I don't really know else, but I do work with BOCES to establish coasters. And also, some of the districts that don't want to do that use Title IV or V monies in order to do that, or grants. The other thing is I'll sign you up for a free trial. If you just want to try it, you want to screen, I'll sign you up for 60 days. I'll take you on a video tour of the system to get you up and running and try it out. Do a screening, use it and see if you like it. Then I think it's easier to support in terms of purchasing.